Before the rain started falling on the fire escape, before the taxi pulled away from the curb with her suitcase still in the trunk, a woman standing in the doorway of a penthouse on the Upper East Side heard 6 words that would follow her for the rest of her life. "I never loved you," he said. He said it the way a man signs a document, without hesitation, without trembling, without looking up. As though the words were a formality, a signature at the bottom of a contract he had already decided to end. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood in the doorframe with one hand on the handle of a leather bag she had packed 20 minutes earlier, while her fingers had still been shaking and her mind had still been running through the list of things she might say to make him change his mind. And she looked at the man she had spent 2 years loving in silence, in secret, in the margins of a life that was never supposed to include someone like her. And she said nothing. Because what do you say to a man who has just told you that the last 2 years were nothing? That the mornings you woke up beside him were accidents? That the way he traced the curve of your shoulder in the dark was reflex, not affection? That the child now growing inside you, the one you haven't told him about, the one you found out about 6 days ago in a pharmacy bathroom with your hands trembling so badly you could barely read the result, that child was fathered by a man who never loved its mother? You say nothing. You pick up your bag. You walk to the elevator. And you press the button for the lobby and watch the doors close on the only life you thought you had. But here is the thing the man in the penthouse didn't know. Here is the thing that would unravel everything. She was 11 weeks pregnant, and she had been about to tell him that night. The cab dropped her at the corner of Alcott and Ninth, in a part of the city that tourists never photographed and guidebooks never mentioned. The buildings here were 4 and 5 stories tall, brick-fronted, with iron railings that had rusted into the color of dried blood. Half the storefronts on the block were shuttered. The ones that were open had handwritten signs taped to their windows offering things in languages the city pretended not to speak. There was a laundromat on the corner that never seemed to close. A bodega next to it with a cat sleeping in the window between stacked rolls of paper towels and a faded lottery sign. Across the street, a church with a cracked bell tower sat between a nail salon and a pawn shop, as if holiness and desperation had agreed to share a wall, and neither had complained. The sidewalks were cracked in patterns that looked almost deliberate, like the concrete had tried to draw a map of all the people who had walked across it and given up halfway through. The streetlights buzzed with the tired hum of things that had been left on too long, and the sky above it all was the color of old dishwater, flat and gray and low enough to make you feel like the whole world had a ceiling. This was where Sable Marin had grown up. This was where she had come back to. Not because she wanted to, but because when a woman has $43 in her checking account and no one left to call, she doesn't go where she wants. She goes where the rent is cheap enough to survive, where the walls are thin, but the questions are thinner. She stood on the sidewalk outside a building she hadn't seen in 4 years, a narrow 5-story walk-up with a green door that had once been brighter and a buzzer panel with half the names scratched off. She looked up at the 4th-floor window. Behind that window was a studio apartment that belonged to a woman named Vashti Koren, who had been Sable's roommate in college and who had answered the phone at 11:30 at night, listened to Sable cry for 9 minutes without interrupting, and then said 5 words that meant more than any promise anyone had ever made her. The keys under the mat. Sable climbed the stairs. The hallway smelled the way it always had, like boiled rice and cleaning product, and the faint metallic tang of old radiators. She found the key. She opened the door. The apartment was small, barely 500 square feet, with a kitchenette that had 2 burners and a window above the sink that looked out onto a brick wall 3 feet away. There was a pull-out couch with a quilt folded on top of it. A lamp on the floor beside a stack of paperback novels. It was not beautiful. It was not comfortable. But the door had a lock, and when Sable turned it, The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was the first thing that had made her feel safe in 6 days. She sat on the edge of the pull-out couch and put her hands on her stomach and spoke to the thing growing inside her for the first time out loud. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she whispered, "but I'm not going to let anyone tell you that you weren't wanted. Because you were. You are. Even if your father doesn't know you exist." The radiator clanged once, like a heartbeat, and the rain outside began to fall harder. Sable Marin was 27 years old. She had dark auburn hair that fell past her shoulders when she let it down, which she rarely did anymore, because letting your hair down was something you did when you felt safe enough to stop paying attention, and Sable had not felt that kind of safety in a long time. Her eyes were the color of black tea held up to the light. She wore clothes that didn't draw attention. She spoke in a voice that didn't carry past the person she was speaking to. She walked into rooms the way certain animals move through open spaces, quickly, quietly, always aware of where the exits were. This was not who she had always been. At 22, she had graduated with honors from a small university upstate with a degree in restoration art. She had been the kind of woman who laughed in public without covering her mouth, who argued with professors about brushstroke authenticity in Flemish altarpieces, who stayed up until 3 in the morning writing papers she actually cared about, fueled by cheap wine and the kind of ambition that doesn't know yet how easily the world can redirect it. She had moved to the city with a portfolio and a plan. She had gotten a job at a gallery on the Lower East Side, a small space that specialized in estate acquisitions. The work was meticulous, the kind that required you to sit with a single painting for weeks, removing varnish 1 millimeter at a time with a cotton swab and solvent, revealing what time had hidden. And then Caesar Kedrov walked into the gallery. He was 41 years old. Tall, broad through the chest, with dark hair cut close and a face that looked like it had been assembled from the most unforgiving parts of Eastern European geography. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie and a watch that cost more than Sable's annual salary. He moved through the gallery the way weather moves through a valley, slowly, inevitably, changing the pressure of every room he entered. He had come to see a small Sargent sketch. Sable brought the painting out on a padded easel, set it beneath the viewing light, and stepped back. She told him what it was: a compositional study, graphite and oil wash, probably 1891, and showed him where the artist had changed his mind about the position of the left hand. He looked at her the way he had looked at the painting, with slow, careful attention. "What's your name?" "Sable." He bought the painting. He paid in cash. And then he came back the next day. Not to buy anything, to ask her a question about the paper stock. He came back the day after that, and the day after that. By the end of the second week, Sable understood that Cesar Kedrov was not coming to the gallery for the art. What she didn't understand, not yet, was what it would cost her to let him in. Because Cesar Kedrov was not a businessman in the way the word is normally used. He was the head of an organization that operated across the eastern seaboard, an enterprise built on silence, on leverage, on the kind of loyalty that is earned through consequence. He employed hundreds. He owned properties in 4 cities. He had a reputation that functioned the way gravity functions, invisibly, constantly, bending everything in its proximity toward itself. And he had never, in 41 years, allowed anyone close enough to see the part of him that sat alone in a penthouse at 2 in the morning, reading poetry in a language his mother had spoken and his father had silenced by the time he was 9, until Sable. She became the exception. The one person who saw him without the architecture of power around him, who sat beside him on a rooftop in October while he told her about a village in the Urals he had never been back to, about a mother who made bread with caraway seeds, about a brother who had died at 16 from something that could have been prevented if anyone with money had cared enough to intervene. He told her things he had never told anyone, and she listened the way she listened to paintings, quietly, patiently, hearing the things beneath the surface that the surface was trying to hide. But exceptions have expiration dates. And 6 days ago, in the bathroom of his penthouse, holding a pregnancy test with two unmistakable lines, Sable had felt the expiration approaching like weather on the horizon. She had planned to tell him that evening. She never got the chance. Because when Caesar came through the door at 9:15, he didn't sit down. He didn't take off his coat. He stood in the foyer and said, "This has to end." He called 2 years of her life a convenience. He said he never loved her. And she packed a bag in 20 minutes, while he stood in the kitchen pouring himself a glass of water as if she were a guest checking out of a hotel. She took her clothes, her phone charger, and the small wooden icon of St. Paraskeva that had belonged to her grandmother. The only personal item she had ever placed in his apartment. He didn't watch her leave. He didn't know that in the bathroom, in the cabinet beneath the sink, was a pregnancy test with two lines on it. Two lines that meant a heartbeat. Two lines that meant everything. And now, sitting on a pull-out couch with $43 and no one left to call, Sable Marin pressed her palms against her stomach and made a decision. She would keep this child. She would raise this child alone. But alone, as she was about to discover, is not always what it appears to be. Because someone was about to walk into her life who would change the meaning of that word entirely. And it would begin with a question asked by a 7-year-old girl on a staircase that smelled like boiled rice. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks in which Sable learned what it meant to build a life out of subtraction. Subtract the penthouse. Subtract the man. Subtract the career. Subtract the version of yourself that believed in things. And see what's left. What was left was this. A woman sleeping on a pull-out couch, working the morning shift at a diner called Harkins, pouring coffee for strangers and clearing plates that still had food on them while her stomach turned from the particular humiliation of carrying a child you cannot afford to feed. Vashti had left a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of bread, and a note that said, "Eat whatever's here. Don't be noble about it." Sable had been noble about it. She rationed everything, supplementing with whatever the kitchen at Harkins let her take home at the end of a shift. Cold toast. Eggs someone had sent back. Soup the cook had made too much of. She was 14 weeks pregnant now. She had been to a free clinic on Garfield Street for an ultrasound. She had lain on the examination table while a technician named Dory moved a wand across her abdomen and pointed at a gray shape on the screen that looked like a lima bean curled inside a thundercloud. "There's the heartbeat," Dory had said. And suddenly, the room was filled with a sound, rapid, rhythmic, and urgent, like a tiny fist knocking on a door from the inside. "Strong heartbeat, 152 beats per minute, right where we want it." Sable stared at the screen, at the flickering pulse inside the gray shape. And she felt something she hadn't felt since the night she left the penthouse. She felt rage. Not the sharp kind, the slow kind, the kind that settles into the bottom of your chest like sediment in a riverbed and stays there, accumulating, becoming something dense and permanent. The kind that comes from understanding exactly how deliberately you were discarded. Because she had replayed that night 100 times. And each time she noticed something new. She noticed that the speech had been prepared, that the decision had been made days before he walked through the door, that the morning before the breakup, when he had pulled her against his chest and breathed into her hair, he had already decided to end it. He had held her knowing he was about to let her go. That was the wound. Not the words. Not the rejection. The wound was the tenderness that preceded it. The performance of love in the hours before the admission. She had kept the ultrasound printout folded in the pocket of her coat, the same coat she zipped over her belly that was just beginning to show. No one at Harkins noticed. No one except a 7-year-old girl named Petra. Petra Tomic lived on the 3rd floor of the building on Alcott and 9th. She was small for her age, with a sharp, narrow face and eyes the color of wet slate that held a quality most people found unsettling in a child, a quality of knowing. Her mother, Lenka, worked nights as a cleaner at an office complex 12 blocks north. She left at 7 each evening and returned at 4:30 in the morning, which meant that for 9 hours every night, Petra was alone. Not neglected. Lenka loved her daughter with the fierce, compressed love of a woman who had crossed 2 borders and buried a husband before she turned 35. But love and presence are not the same thing, and Petra had learned the difference early. She had a routine for the hours alone. She did her homework at the kitchen table. She made herself a sandwich from whatever was in the refrigerator. She watched television with the volume low because the woman in the apartment next door banged on the wall if it was too loud. She locked the door. She checked the lock. She checked it again. And then she read. She read anything she could find, library books mostly, the kind with cracked spines and other children's names written in pencil on the inside covers. She read them slowly, not because she was a slow reader, she was exceptionally fast, but because reading slowly meant the story lasted longer, and lasting longer meant fewer minutes of silence before her mother's key turned in the lock at 4:30. Sable met Petra on a Tuesday evening, climbing the stairs after a double shift. The girl was sitting on the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors, with a book about ocean exploration open on her knees. "You're the lady who lives in Vashti's apartment," Petra said. It was not a question. "Are you sick?" she asked next, studying Sable's posture. "You hold your stomach different from my mom. She only holds her stomach when she's sick." "I'm not sick," Sable said carefully. "Why are you sitting on the stairs?" "The light bulb in our hallway went out. I don't like the dark." "Where's your mom?" "Working." "Is someone else home with you?" "No, but I'm fine. I have a key and a book and a sandwich." She said it the way Sable had said, "We're fine," to every person who had ever asked her how things were going with Caesar. With the practiced, automated smoothness of someone who has rehearsed the answer so many times, it no longer requires thought. Sable offered leftover soup from the diner. Petra said she wasn't supposed to go into other people's apartments. Sable brought it down in a ceramic mug. The girl held it with both hands, the way someone holds something precious, and blew on each spoonful before tasting it. Not because it was too hot, but because blowing on soup was something she had seen her mother do. When the soup was gone, Petra said, "Are you going to have a baby?" The staircase went quiet. Even the radiator paused. "Yes," Sable said. She didn't know why she told the truth. She hadn't told anyone yet. But something about the way this child asked, directly, without pretense, made the lie impossible. Petra nodded. Then she said, "Is the dad going to help?" "No. He doesn't know. My dad died before I was born. Mom said he was good. She said he would have stayed. But he got sick, and he couldn't." She paused. "Some dads can't stay, and some dads won't. My mom says the ones who can't are sad, and the ones who won't are worse than sad. They're just empty." The sentence hit Sable in the sternum like a stone dropped from a height. Because a 7-year-old had just described Caesar Kedrov more accurately than Sable had managed in 3 weeks of trying. Empty. A man who had hollowed himself out so thoroughly in the service of control that when something real and vulnerable tried to grow inside the space where his heart should have been, he had looked at it and seen inconvenience. "You can sit on the stairs with me whenever you want," Petra said. "I'm here most nights." And that was how it started, with a mug of chicken soup and a standing invitation to share a staircase. But below them, on the ground floor, the green door opened with a gust of cold October air, and a man stepped into the hallway. His name was Dima Varnik. He was Cesar Kedrov's fixer, his shadow. He had been with Cesar for 14 years, and in those years he had never once questioned an order. Until 3 hours ago, when Caesar had found a pregnancy test with 2 lines beneath the bathroom sink and said 2 words, Find her. Dima had found her. The next step was to call Caesar and report her location. He took out his phone. His thumb hovered over the call button. And then, from upstairs, he heard the child's voice. Some dads can't stay, and some dads won't. My mom says the ones who can't are sad, and the ones who won't are worse than sad. They're just empty. Dima put the phone back in his pocket. Dima Varnik was 44 years old. He stood 6'1", with a lean build that suggested not gym-sculpted vanity, but the functional economy of a body that had learned to move efficiently through difficult spaces. His face was narrow, angular, with deep-set eyes the color of smoke trapped behind glass, and a mouth that rarely smiled, but when it did, it changed his entire face from something guarded into something almost gentle. Almost. The gentleness never lasted long. He had been born in Sumy, in northeastern Ukraine, in an apartment block with yellow walls and a courtyard where old men played chess on upturned crates. His mother, Helena, had raised him alone after his father left when Dima was 4. She had worked 3 jobs. She cleaned offices in the morning, sorted mail in the afternoon, and sewed alterations on weekends for a tailor who paid her in cash. She ate after Dima ate. She slept after Dima slept. She wore the same 2 dresses for 3 years and told him they were her favorites because she didn't want him to know they were her only ones. She had died when Dima was 19. Pneumonia. A thing that should not have killed a woman of 41. But Helena's body had been running on fumes for so long that when the infection came, there was nothing left to fight it with. She had been admitted to the hospital on a Thursday and died on a Sunday, and the last thing she said to Dima, while he sat beside her holding her hand that felt like paper, was, "Don't become the kind of man who looks away." He had carried that sentence for 25 years. He had carried it through the immigration process that brought him to New York at 21. He had carried it through the years of enforcement work, the collections, and the quiet restructurings of other people's lives that Caesar required and Dima delivered. He had carried it through 100 situations where looking away would have been easier, and looking away was exactly what he'd done, because his mother's instruction and his employer's requirements occupied opposite ends of a hallway. He walked every day without ever reaching either door. And now he was standing in this actual hallway, listening to a woman's voice upstairs and a child's voice talking about calcium, and something inside him shifted the way tectonic plates shift, slowly, deep underground. He understood that Caesar had not told him what he wanted with Sable, had not said whether the intention was reconciliation or control. And Dima understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent years studying another man's patterns, that Cesar Kedrov did not search for things he didn't want to own. He walked out the green door. He stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the 4th-floor window. This time he did not call Cesar Kedrov. He called a woman named Marit Pol, a legal aid attorney who worked out of a storefront office on Klassen Avenue in Brooklyn. She handled custody disputes, protective orders, and the kind of quiet legal work that existed in the spaces between what the law said and what powerful men did. "It's late," Maret said. "I know. I have a situation." "Your situations are always complicated. This one is personal." There was a pause. In 6 years, Dima had never used that word. He told her everything, about Sable, about the pregnancy, about Caesar. "What do you want me to do?" Marit asked. "I want you to get to her before he does." "You're choosing a side." "I'm choosing not to look away." Marit said, "Give me the address. I'll be there in the morning." Dima hung up. He stood on the sidewalk and felt, for the first time in years, the weight of his mother's words shift from a burden to a bearing. A compass needle that had been spinning for 25 years and had finally found north. He did not report Sable's location, and in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, Cesar Kedrov sat alone, holding a pregnancy test with 2 lines on it, feeling something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. fear, not of enemies or exposure. The fear that he had destroyed the only thing that had ever made him feel like the boy he had once been, sitting in a kitchen watching his mother's hands move through dough. He waited for Dima's call, a call that would never come. Marit Pol arrived the next morning. She was 53, compact, with silver-streaked hair and a leather satchel so overstuffed the clasp no longer closed. She had a face that expressed everything at a delay, as though her thoughts arrived at her features a few seconds after they had already been processed and approved for external display. She climbed to the 4th floor and knocked. The door opened 4 inches, held by the chain. Sable Marin? My name is Marit Pol. I'm a legal aid attorney. Someone who cares about your safety asked me to come speak with you. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell you what your options are. Are you connected to Caesar? I know who he is. I'm not connected to him. I'm connected to people who need protection from people like him. People don't just show up at your door because someone called them. Some people do. The ones who've seen what happens when nobody does. Sable closed the door. The chain slid. The door opened again. Come in. Sable sat at the small table and told Marit everything in one breath. The pregnancy, the father, the organization, the $43, the borrowed apartment, the diner job. She told her that Kizar would want control, not the baby, not her, just control, because that was the only language he spoke. Marit listened without moving. Then she said, "You are not trapped. I know the money feels like a wall and the lack of family feels like a wall. But walls have doors, and my job is to find them." She outlined what she could do. Prenatal paternity framework, preemptive custody documentation, connection to a domestic safety organization, an order of protection within 24 hours if needed. Can you actually protect me from someone like him? The law is the one thing men like him can't buy outright. They can delay it. They can complicate it. But they cannot make a family court judge unsee documentation. Then Sable told her the rest. The rules of the relationship: never call during business hours, never appear unannounced, and never mention his name to anyone, not friends, not co-workers, not the woman at the dry cleaner who once asked why Sable was picking up a man's suit. Never ask where he went when he left at 3 in the morning. Never ask who called when his phone rang and his face changed and he stepped into the other room and closed the door. She had followed every rule. She had made herself small enough to fit inside the space he allowed her, and she had told herself that the space was enough, because the alternative was no space at all. The slow isolation, how he hadn't pushed her friends away but replaced them. He made himself available on the nights she would have seen them, and the dinners with him were always better than whatever she would have done instead, and slowly, gradually, the friends fell away. Not because he pushed them, because he replaced them. He never told her to leave the gallery, but he started giving her money, not large amounts, enough to cover her rent, her groceries. And each thing he covered was one less reason she needed the job, and each reason that disappeared made the job feel smaller, until she looked at her life and realized that every single thread of it led back to him. She didn't have a life. She had a radius, and he was the center of it. That's the threat, Sable said. Not the kind you can file a report about. The kind that rewrites your life so quietly you don't hear it happening until one day you try to leave and realize you've forgotten how. Then Marit told Sable something that changed the air in the room. He found the pregnancy test. He's looking for you. The person sent to find you chose not to report your location. That person contacted me instead. He's looking for me. He gave the order. But for the first time, someone inside his organization chose to protect you instead of obey him. You're not as alone as you think. Sable pressed her hands against her stomach. What happens when he finds out where I am? By the time he does, you'll have documentation, legal standing, and a protective order in place. He'll find a wall where he expected to find a door. He doesn't respect walls. Then we'll build the kind he hasn't encountered before, the kind with a judge's name on it. Sable looked at the ultrasound printout on the table. 152 beats per minute. 152, she whispered. Marit nodded. Then let's make sure it gets to 153. Within 48 hours, Marit had filed a preemptive custody petition with the family court. 41 pages outlining the circumstances of the relationship, the coercive dynamics, and the specific characteristics of the father that made unsupervised access a risk. On the third day, she filed for an order of protection. The judge, Honorable Brigid Kane, reviewed the affidavit twice, studied the financial patterns showing how Caesar had incrementally replaced every independent structure in Sable's life, and signed the order. It prohibited Caesar Kedrov or anyone acting on his behalf from contacting Sable, approaching within 500 feet of her residence or workplace, or filing any custody action without first appearing before the court. A fortress built from paper. But paper with a judge's signature is stronger than concrete, because concrete can be broken with enough force. A court order can only be broken with consequence. While Marit worked the legal machinery, Dima worked the other kind. He did 3 things. First, he contacted a former colleague named Bojan Kress, who ran a private security consultancy. He asked for a 2-person detail posted across the street from the building on Alcott and 9th. Their job: observe and report if anyone connected to the organization appeared. Second, he went to the penthouse during hours he knew Caesar would be at the warehouse in Red Hook. He opened the desk drawer. The pregnancy test was there. Beside it was a photograph he had never seen before. A woman in a kitchen with yellow walls, smiling, holding a loaf of dark bread. Caesar's mother. Dima looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he opened the filing cabinet and photographed every page of Caesar's personal asset documentation, not as leverage, as evidence a family court judge would need. Third, he called the building superintendent, a man named Gordic, who responded to cash the way flowers respond to sunlight. He paid for the hallway light bulb on the 3rd floor. He paid for the radiator repair in apartment 3B. He left no name. That night, Petra Tomic walked down the hallway to her apartment and stopped. The light was on. The hallway light that had been burned out for 3 weeks. The one that made the corridor dark enough that she sat on the staircase every evening was on. It cast a warm, yellow glow across the carpet, which was still worn, still threadbare, but it was lit. And Petra stood in that light for a moment, blinking, adjusting to the sudden presence of something she'd stopped expecting. She went inside. The radiator was working. Not clanking, not hissing. Working. The apartment was warm. Actually warm. The kind of warm that makes your body remember what it feels like to stop bracing against the cold. She sat on the floor beside the radiator and read for 2 hours without getting up, without checking the lock, without listening for sounds in the hallway. And when her mother came home at 4:30 and found her asleep on the floor with the book open on her chest, Lenka knelt down and pulled a blanket over her daughter and whispered something in a language Petra didn't speak but understood, because some words don't need translation. They need warmth. And for the first time in a long time, there was warmth. Dima did not visit Sable. He did not introduce himself. He existed in the architecture of her safety the way a foundation exists beneath a building, unseen, unfelt, bearing weight. He fed Marit information in pieces, timed to coincide with the legal proceedings, financial records, communication logs, organizational charts. Marit built a case the way an engineer builds a bridge, calculating load, distributing weight, ensuring no single point of failure. The structure held because it was built on paper, on dates and documented patterns, on the quiet, irrefutable math of a life that had been systematically redirected until it orbited a single point. Caesar did what Dima expected. He hired a private investigator. Then he hired a second one. He contacted attorneys who charged 4 figures an hour and spoke in the confident, measured tone of men who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He assembled resources with the unspoken certainty that any problem could be solved by applying the correct amount of pressure. But when his lead attorney, Whitfield, contacted the family court to file a counter-petition for paternity recognition and custodial rights, he was informed that a preemptive petition had already been filed, that an order of protection was in place, that the respondent had legal representation, and that any attempt to contact the petitioner, directly or through intermediaries, would constitute a violation of the order and would be addressed accordingly. Whitfield called Caesar with the news. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, something happened in the penthouse that Whitfield would later describe to a colleague, off the record, as the only time in 8 years he had heard Khazar Khedrov's voice change. Not louder, not angrier. Something underneath the control, beneath the discipline, below the surface that Caesar maintained the way a frozen lake maintains its surface, by keeping everything that moved and threatened to break through pressed firmly beneath the ice. Someone told her, Caesar said, someone inside my organization. Whitfield did not respond. It was not a legal matter. And Whitfield had survived 8 years of representing Caesar Khedrov by knowing exactly which conversations to stay out of. Caesar hung up. He opened the desk drawer and looked at the pregnancy test and the photograph of his mother. He had expected the search to be simple. He had expected to find Sable in some rented room somewhere, frightened and pliable, and to reclaim what was his. The woman, the child, the situation, the way he reclaimed every asset that had ever slipped beyond his reach. What he had not expected was a wall. A legal, documented, court-ordered wall with a judge's name on it, and a foundation built from evidence he didn't know existed. What he had not expected was that someone had chosen her. Someone who knew him well enough to anticipate every move he would make, because that someone had spent 14 years watching him make those moves. Caesar looked at the photograph, at the bread, at the yellow kitchen, at the birch tree in the window. He understood who had betrayed him. He did not make a phone call. He did not issue an order. He sat in the silence and let the understanding settle the way snow settles, slowly, completely, covering everything. 5 months later, on a Tuesday in March, Sable gave birth to a boy. He arrived at 6:47 in the morning, with Marit in the waiting room and Vashti holding Sable's hand. He weighed 6 pounds, 11 ounces. He had dark hair, a crumpled red face, and fists so tightly clenched they looked like he had arrived already holding on to something he refused to let go of. Sable named him Ivo, not after anyone. She chose the name because it meant yew tree, and because the yew is a thing that grows slowly, endures cold, and outlasts the things around it not through force but through patience. She brought Ivo home to a new apartment, a 1-bedroom on Delancey Street, rent covered for a year through an emergency assistance program Maret had connected her to. The apartment had a bedroom with a window that faced east, and the morning sun came in at an angle that fell directly across the crib, warming the sheets, warming the baby's face, warming the small wooden icon of St. Paraskeva that Sable had placed on the windowsill, the same icon she had taken from the penthouse the night she left. Petra came to visit on the 3rd day with a gift wrapped in newspaper and tied with yarn. Inside was a library book about deep-sea creatures. "This is for Ivo," she said. "Petra, he can't read yet. He's 3 days old." "I know, but he will. And when he does, he should start with something good." Petra looked at the baby sleeping in the crib with his fists clenched. "He looks angry. He looks determined. That's the same thing when you're small." Sable laughed, the first real laugh she had produced in months. In the weeks that followed, the apartment accumulated the small evidence of a life being built. A high chair, a changing table, A mobile of paper cranes Vashti had folded from old-fashioned magazines, so the cranes had patterns on their wings, plaid and floral and geometric, turning slowly above the crib in the draft from the window. A rug from a thrift store, blue and gold, with a fringe that Ivo would later learn to pull with his fingers while making a sound that was not quite a word, but was close. Sable went back to work at Harkins when Ivo was 7 weeks old. The diner's cook, Oleg, who had never asked Sable a personal question in 5 months, but who had quietly doubled the portion of soup he sent home with her every shift, installed a second-hand bassinet in the storage room behind the kitchen without telling anyone. It sat between a shelf of canned tomatoes and a stack of napkin boxes, and Ivo slept in it while Sable worked, and the sound of the kitchen, the clanking of plates, the hiss of the griddle became the background music of his earliest memories. Sable ate her whole lunch every day. She did not wrap the second half in a napkin. She did not ration. She did not count dollars with the silent arithmetic of a woman who has learned that food is a finite resource. She ate because her body was feeding a child, and the child was feeding something inside her that had been starved for longer than the pregnancy, longer than the 2 years with Cesar, longer than she could trace. It was purpose, not abstract purpose, but the specific, physical, undeniable kind that came from a 6-pound human who could not lift his own head, but who turned toward the sound of her voice the way a compass needle turns toward north. One Tuesday evening, with Ivo asleep and the paper cranes turning and the icon catching the last of the evening light, she did something she hadn't done since her last day at the gallery. She picked up a brush. A small one, a #2 round, bought for $3.40, along with a tube of cadmium yellow and a tube of burnt sienna, and a small canvas board that cost less than a cup of coffee. She painted what the view from the window felt like, the way the light came in, the way the shadows fell across the crib, the way the cranes moved. She painted it in warm tones, golds and ambers, and the deep brown of bread crust. And when she finished, she held it up and looked at it, and felt something inside her chest that had been closed for a very long time, carefully, slowly, begin to open. She hung the painting on the wall above the crib. It was small. It was imperfect. The perspective was slightly off, and the cadmium yellow had bled into the burnt sienna in one corner. But it was hers. She had made it with her own hands, the same hands that had once restored masterpieces, the same hands that had once trembled while packing a bag in a penthouse, the same hands that now changed diapers and poured coffee and held a child who turned toward her voice. Hers. On a Saturday in April, Sable walked into Harkin's diner with Ivo in a carrier strapped to her chest. The bell rang. The waitress said, "Hey, Mama." She sat in the corner booth by the window. Petra arrived 20 minutes later with Lenka beside her. Lenka Tomic, who worked nights and slept mornings and existed in the margins of her daughter's life, the way the moon exists in the margins of the sky. She was there, standing in the doorway of a diner on a Saturday morning with her daughter, and that alone was something that would not have happened 3 months ago, before the radiator started working, before the hallway light came on, before the small, invisible interventions of a man she had never met had rearranged the architecture of her evenings just enough that she could rest a little deeper and wake up on a Saturday with enough energy to say yes. Petra ordered pancakes because she had recently decided they were the most structurally interesting food, since they are liquid that becomes solid through heat, which she said was basically the same as lava becoming rock. Lenka ordered coffee and toast. Sable ordered a club sandwich and ate the whole thing. Petra leaned across the table and touched Ivo's hand. One finger, placed carefully against his tiny fist, and Ivo's fist opened, just slightly, just enough to close around Petra's finger and hold it. Her face changed. The clinical quality, the too old for her age armor, softened. Her eyes widened. "He's holding me," she whispered. "He is." He doesn't even know me. He knows you're here. Sometimes that's enough. Then Petra looked at Sable, and her voice was the voice of a 7-year-old who had spent most of her life being careful and quiet and alone. Sable, I'm glad you didn't go back. The sentence landed in the diner like a stone dropped into still water. The cook looked up. The waitress paused. Lenka set her mug down and looked at her daughter with an expression that contained pride and heartbreak, and the grief of a mother who realizes her child has understood more than she was ever supposed to understand. I'm glad too, Sable said. Outside the diner, across the street, a dark sedan idled at the curb. Dima Varnik could see shapes through the foggy glass: a woman with a baby on her chest, a child leaning across the table, a thin woman holding coffee. He had not spoken to Caesar in 5 months. He had dismantled his connection to that world room by room. There had been consequences. Caesar had sent people to communicate, through presence alone, that the betrayal had been catalogued. Dima had made it understood that certain information he possessed would find its way to agencies the organization had spent decades avoiding. It was not a threat. Dima didn't make threats. He made arrangements. Caesar had not tested them. Not because he lacked the will. Because something else had intervened. The photograph in the desk drawer. His mother's face. He had looked at it every night since finding the pregnancy test, and something had happened to him. Not the dramatic transformation that stories promise. Something slower. Something more like erosion. The ice that had covered the surface of him for 30 years was not cracking. It was thinning. And through it, the shape of something underneath was becoming visible. A boy who had grown into a man who controlled everything because he had never been able to control the one thing that mattered. The loss that had made him. The absence that had taught him that love was a liability. The lie, because it was a lie, it had always been a lie, was the most expensive thing he had ever said. But that realization was his to carry. It was not Sable's burden. It was not the child's inheritance. Dima put the car in drive. He looked at the diner one more time, and he felt, for the first time in 25 years, his mother's words settle into place, not as a burden, as a benediction. She had not meant it as a prohibition. She had meant it as a promise. That looking, truly looking, at the suffering in front of you and choosing to act was not a sacrifice. It was the whole point. He drove north. The morning light fell across the windshield in long slants that made the city look like a painting someone had started but not yet finished. The kind that needed patience. The kind that revealed what time had hidden, one layer at a time. He did not look back. Because looking back was for men who doubted what they'd done, and Dima had no doubts. Back in the diner, Petra withdrew her finger from Ivo's fist. His hand stayed open for a moment. Then it closed again. Around nothing. Around air. Around the memory of a touch his mind would not retain, but his body might, someday, recognize. Sable looked at her son, at his clenched fists, at the face that looked like hers and the eyes that looked like his father's, and the determination that belonged to neither of them and both of them, and something entirely new. And she thought of a night, 7 months ago, when she had sat on a pull-out couch and whispered, "I'm not going to let anyone tell you that you weren't wanted." She knew now what she was going to do. She was going to raise this child with steady hands and warm soup and library books about the ocean floor. She was going to raise him in a 1-bedroom apartment with paper cranes and a painting on the wall and a lock on the door that she had earned the right to turn. She was going to raise him to be the kind of man who doesn't look away. The bell above the diner door rang as someone walked in. Cold air swept across the floor. Ivo stirred against her chest, his fists tightening, then relaxing, then tightening again, like a heart learning its own rhythm. And somewhere on Delancey Street, in a quiet apartment with eastern light and a crib and a small wooden icon on the windowsill, a deadbolt waited in its locked position. Faithful. patient, holding the door shut against everything that had been, and holding it open for everything that was about to become. Not perfect, not easy, but hers.